Hi everyone, so let's now turn to the aggregate supply. Now when it comes to aggregate supply, we must distinguish firstly between the short run aggregate supply curve, which we will look at in this lesson, and the long run aggregate supply curve, which we'll look at in our next lesson. Okay, so let's take a look at what aggregate supply more generally helps us to understand firstly though. So really, aggregate supply is about the total output that can be generated by firms in an economy at the different price levels within that economy. So if you look at the actual diagram that we have for an aggregate supply curve here, a short run aggregate supply curve, we can see on our vertical axis we have the price level, meanwhile on the horizontal axis we have real GDP. So that is the total value of output generated in the economy. Okay, so we see our short run aggregate supply curve here. Now what is the difference firstly between the short run and the long run? Okay, well let's just take a look. So when it comes to the short run, we've got to bear in mind that wage rates and prices of all other factor inputs are fixed. Okay, so it means that we are fixing at that particular point in time wage rates and the cost of inputs. Okay, all right, now this is important to understand, and we'll look at why this may change, of course, in an economy in just a moment. Okay, now the curve, as we can see, is upward sloping. We've seen that aggregate demand is downward sloping, well the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. There's two main reasons really as to why this is the case. Firstly, that firms increase prices when the demand for their goods is high. So as economic output increases, as we move further out and accordingly reach a higher level of equilibrium output on real GDP there, we can see that the price level increases. Now, of course, that may result in demand pull inflation, and we would see that in our first explanation there. But secondly, we've also seen, of course, in microeconomics that we have upward sloping market supply curves. And that is the fact that when it comes to supplying goods in a market, you will attract more firms to a given market if the price level is high. So if the price of particular goods is very high, then more firms will want to enter that market and provide that supply. So there's two clear reasons there as to why this is upward sloping. Now, of course, there are a number of factors that can cause a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve. Now let's just come back briefly to this definition of the short run here, where wage rates and prices of all other factor inputs are fixed. So this assumes constant wage rates and factor input costs according to this given level of supply. So if there was a shift in aggregate demand, you would get a movement along the actual curve corresponding with that increase in demand. Okay, so factors causing a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve, well, labour costs. So if wages actually increase, then the impact of that will be to shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the left, and then we would reach short run aggregate supply 2, and we can see that's at a higher price level. Okay, meanwhile, if material costs actually came down in price and material costs could be brought into the firm more cheaply, more easily, then we may be able to attain short run aggregate supply curve 3 there. Okay, so these two areas, when it comes to labour costs and material costs, these are your direct costs involved in producing goods, and they're also known as input costs. Okay, it's these areas that can really generate cost push inflation, and of course cost push inflation would be represented by that increase in the decrease in the supply curve from short run aggregate supply curve 1 to SRAS 2. Okay, at that higher price level. However, The last example we have as well is about taxation and subsidies. So when it comes to taxation, that raises the actual costs of producing the given goods or services. So therefore, we would again reach SRAS 2. Okay, take for instance with the sugar tax. That is of course intended to actually reduce demand by charging a higher price for those sugary drinks. Now that of course would shift the supply curve to the left and decrease the level of supply due to those higher costs of actually supplying that good. Okay guys, that's it for this session. We'll come back to the short run aggregate supply curve in subsequent lessons though. Okay.